Well, today is July the 1st, and today Canada turns 151 years old. 151 is a kind of nothing anniversary. Last year, 150 was a really big deal, but 151 doesn't sound very significant, does it? Yet still, it marks another year in the life of our country, Canada, and it's worth pausing and reflecting upon. Our 150-year-old Canada is a very complex and very diverse nation. We have a very large number of Canadians today, 1 in 5 actually, who were not born in this country. Either by themselves or with their parents, they came to Canada from some other part of the world. They were not born here. We still have a substantial number of Canadians whose ancestors came from the British Isles or some other part of Europe, but increasingly, new Canadians today are coming from Asia, they're coming from South America, they're coming from Africa. And to make the mixture even more complex, there are an increasing number of Aboriginal Canadians. The growth rate amongst Aboriginals is much higher than it is for the country as a whole. And they keep reminding us that originally this was their land, and we stole it. Well, we don't like being reminded of that, no matter how true it may or may not be. When it comes to faith and to religion, at the age of 151, that too is a rather complicated situation. Christianity is still by far the largest faith in Canada, and the Roman Catholics have by far the most adherents amongst Christians. About 67% of Canadians claim to be a Christian. Now, I wonder if you know what the next largest group is. Christians, and then what would the next largest group be? I heard Jewish. I heard Muslim. Not even close. The next largest group are people who claim to have no religion whatsoever. We could call them atheists or agnostics or whatever you want to call them, but they claim no religion. Do you know how many there are? 25% of Canadians now claim to have no religion whatsoever. Actually, to be honest, it's 23.9%. The third largest group are the Muslims, Islam, but before you get excited about it, it's just 3% of our population. Very small group. So 67% of us claim to be Christians, but sadly, most of those are what we call cultural Christians. They rarely practice their faith, and they know even less about it. And there's only one time in the entire year when most Christians make an effort to come to church. What date would that be? I heard Christmas, and that's correct. Christmas Eve, to be specific. That's the one, you can't call it Sunday because Christmas Eve can fall on any day of the week, but that's the one time in the year when more Christians than any other try to get to church. In the old days, we used to talk about C and E Christians. Do any of you know what I mean when I say C and E Christians? Yeah, quite a few of you do. You have to be an oldie to know, because it was a play on words. C of E often meant, in the old days, Church of England, but when we said it, we meant Christmas and Easter Christians. Those members of our congregation we would see at Christmas, and the next time you'd see them would be Easter. And I actually remember being in a church when the minister, and he shouldn't have done it, in my humble opinion, I think it was a very rude thing to do, but at the end of the Christmas service, he wished everybody a happy Easter. Today, we don't have C and E members because Easter is just another Sunday. It's not the big Sunday it used to be. This Sunday here, Easter Sunday, I looked at across the congregation, and it wasn't just a normal-sized congregation. People don't make a special effort to come out on Easter any longer. I wish those who claim to be Christians, that's 67% of our population, would come even a little more often. I think it would surprise them at how much good that it would do them. Now, in spite of the fact that a quarter of our country claim no faith of any kind, our country still has a very strong Christian heritage. And Kathy's children's time was really good because it showed all of the different passages of Scripture literally carved in stone on our Parliament buildings. Christian values and beliefs founded this land, and they're at the core of who we are. Our Canadian motto, our coat of arms, reads Amare usque ad mare. And that's Latin. Almost all mottos are still written in Latin. And it comes from Zechariah 9:10 in the Old Testament, and it also comes from Psalm 72:8, the very same verse. He shall have dominion from sea to sea and from the river to the ends of the earth. In Hebrew, that was an expression, from sea to sea and from the river to the ends of the earth, and it was an expression that meant the whole wide world. And in Hebrew, the word dominion is a verb. It's an action word. So to try to translate it into English properly, it's about God's constant creative energy and power shaping and reshaping the world. In other words, our motto tells us that by the grace of God, Canada is a land that will be forever being grown and reshaping itself in peace and love with justice from sea to sea. And that's a wonderful motto. Couldn't be a better one. The motto for the Order of Canada also comes from the Bible, and this time from the New Testament. It's our highest national honor. I've only known a few people who had the Order of Canada. It was established in 1967, centennial year, by Prime Minister Lester B. Pearson. And the man who actually designed it was John Ross Matheson from Brockville. John was a veteran of World War II. He came home injured. He was badly injured during the war. He always walked with two canes. And John Matheson was a member of this church. He taught Sunday school here in this church. I don't know, is there anybody here who remembers him teaching you Sunday school? Wendy, you do. Okay. I know the Sheridans, I don't think Herb is here this morning. The Sheridans were in his Sunday school class. I knew John well when he was older, and he died 5 years ago at the age of 96. If you go back to 1960, he was elected to Parliament from Leeds and Grenville, and Lester Pearson tapped him to do two special things. The first was to help design a new flag for Canada, and the second was to create a new honor called the Order of Canada. Today, a lot of people know that John Matheson played a strong role in the creation of our new flag, our maple leaf flag, but very few are aware that he actually was the one who put together the Order of Canada. And he chose the motto, and he chose it from Hebrews 11:16. They desired a better country. In Latin, the inscription beneath every Order of Canada medal reads, Desideanteris meliorum patriam. They desired a better country. I kind of think Wall Street should get some credit for this, but I'm dreaming in paradise. That's not going to happen. The book of Hebrews, from which John took that passage, is about faith. It says that faith is the assurance of things hoped for. It's the conviction of things we cannot see. And it talks about those who came before us, who heeded the call of God and reached out in faith for a better country, a heavenly city, and how they remained faithful to that call, even though they themselves were never able to see it. And I guess what I would like you to know this day is it's not just those who came before us who were in that category, who were trying to find a better land that they would never see. It's you and me as well. You and I are striving to make this a better land. And we will never see the results of what we're doing. But Canada is a work in progress, and it always will be. And our task is to be like that, to be those who reach out to do what is good, even though maybe we'll never see it ourselves. Our first Prime Minister, Sir John A. Macdonald, spent many years putting this country together, bit by bit. He led Ontario and Quebec, which was one colony, the Maritimes, which was a second colony, Nova Scotia, which was the third, and Prince Edward Island, the fourth, into Confederation. And it may sound like it was just a slam dunk, but it was not. It was incredibly difficult. These colonies all had different histories and different ideas and different priorities, and they weren't at all sure that they wanted to come together. And he was the one that did it. It culminated 151 years ago in the birth of a new nation, and they called it the Dominion of Canada. Most people don't know why, but again, it comes from the Bible. He shall have dominion from sea to sea. And they called it a dominion because they were afraid if they called it a kingdom that the Americans might be unhappy. And so we called it a dominion. Today we just simply call it our country, Canada. The country that was put together 151 years ago was not perfect. It was anything but. And the person who put it together, John A. Macdonald, was not perfect. It has come to light fairly recent. It's been kind of bubbling up that the way he regarded our Aboriginal Canadians was all too common in his time, and that is they were called savages. By contrast, we of European descent, we were enlightened. The Indians were savage. They had nothing to teach us. We had everything to teach them. That was the attitude. And Sir John M. Macdonald tended to share that attitude. Now, we've come a long, long way past that ugly and totally fallacious attitude, but we're not there yet. We're a work in progress. We have a long, long way to go. And before we come down too hard on Sir John A. Macdonald and start renaming buildings and pulling his statues down, I think it's worth realizing that nobody's perfect. You're not perfect. I'm not perfect. None of us are, and he wasn't either. And yet, if you think about it for a minute, God uses flawed people to do his will. Because you see, there's no other kind of people out there. We're all flawed. It's true that Sir John A. Macdonald was a man of his time, but it's equally true that without him, almost certainly, this country would not exist the way it does today. History is not something that just automatically happens. History happens because certain people make decisions and drive certain things. This country is together in large measure because of Sir John A. Macdonald. And it's easy for us to forget how difficult and dangerous the time was. In 1867, when we put this country together, down south of the border, the Americans had just concluded the Civil War, North against South. And the North by the time that war ended, had an army of 2 million men. It was the strongest, best equipped, best army in the world by far. And there were voices south of the border urging that they march north and take over British North America. And that's who we were. Well, it didn't happen, largely because of wise people like Abraham Lincoln. I think it didn't happen because of people like Sir John Macdonald, who said, we got to come together. We got to stand united in this country. Today, we still live in an incredibly unpredictable world. From the incredibly cruel immigration measures south of the border, to the genocide of the Rohingya people in Myanmar, to the rise of right-wing autocrats in Europe and in Turkey, it almost seems like the world's going backwards. And one of the things that is rather clear to me is that vast numbers of people today have totally forgotten the lessons of World War II. I grew up in the shadow of that war, and so it was just overwhelmingly important to me. My father was a veteran. He was in the Air Force during the war. And so I knew why we fought it. I knew the enormous value of a society that is democratic and caring. And I knew just instinctively what autocrats and dictators can do. And I wonder, have people today totally forgotten that? You know, if you don't learn the lessons of history, you're doomed to repeat them. And I hope we don't go there. There's too many autocrats being elected democratically, and once you put them in, don't count on getting them out. The United Nations has declared Canada to be one of the best places in the world to live. I know you're probably aware of that. There are literally, I mean literally, millions of people who would love to come and live here. In fact, one of our biggest problems today is the stream of refugees coming into our country from, of all places, America. I would never have thought of that. And yet, we have miles to go to make this a better country. I was thinking of that phrase, miles to go before I sleep. Do you know where it came from? Robert Frost wrote a famous poem. And it's almost the mirror image of today. Today it's hot and steamy, and we're close to the longest day of the year, just past us last week. He wrote his poem about the shortest day of the year. And it's called Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening. Whose woods these are, I think I know. His house is in the village, though. He will not see me stopping here to watch his woods fill up with snow. My little horse must think it queer to stop without a farmhouse near. Between the woods and frozen lake, the darkest evening of the year. He gives his harness bells a shake to ask if there is some mistake. The only other sound's the sweep of easy wind and downy flake. The woods are lovely, dark and deep, but I have promises to keep, and miles to go before I sleep, and miles to go before I sleep. I think that sums up in many ways our beautiful country, so blessed, and yet we have miles to go before we can even think of relaxing, let alone sleeping. And I want to close with an inscription found on the cornerstone of an old English church. It reads, in the year 1653, when all things sacred in this kingdom were being either profaned or demolished, this church was built by Sir Richard Shirley Baronet, to whose singular praise it was to do the best of things in the worst of times. And that's a wonderful motto for all of us. If you're like me, you get so upset by listening to the news, you want to just turn it off and not listen anymore and wonder what's going wrong with our world. And yet I believe we're called to do our best in the worst of times. We're called to do our best no matter what the times may be. And if we can all strive to do this, the future of this land will remain forever bright. So, happy birthday, Canada. Amen. Our closing hymn